Our first is Mary Jo Bona, and then we have Judith Kroll. They've been asked to prepare presentations for a general audience, and we really hope to enhance the cross-disciplinary conversation. And I know a lot of universities talk about that, but I think we do that very well here because of our faculty and staff and our students and a commitment to that, because it brings labor, it brings a lot of challenges, it pushes you outside of your disciplinary comfort zone, and it's a special thing that we do here. So we're going to begin today with Professor Bona. She's a distinguished professor in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and English, as well as the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences. She's been on our faculty since 1999. Her research expertise is in feminist literary studies, examining the nexus between gender and ethnicity with transnational migratory identities, material cultures, and Italian diaspora studies as primary intersections. Her talk today is called Mother's Mobility Narrative, Othermothering and Maso's The Art Lover in the AIDS Era. She'll deliver about a 25-minute talk, so again, we've asked everyone to give somewhat shorter talks to be able to enhance the consumability and the quality of our conversation afterwards. We'll have a few questions after, and we have microphones on each side, and so we just ask that you step up to those. To give her a proper introduction, we have Professor Liz Montegari. She's an associate professor and chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And before I introduce her, I did just want to say a few things about her. So she received her PhD in Cultural Studies from the University of California, Davis, in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, her MA, from Rutgers University. Her research and training interests include feminist and queer cultural studies, transnational American studies, LGBT activist movements, the militarization of everyday life, and mobility, disability, and the body. I also want to say she is one of the most caring, thoughtful, honest, genuine chairs that anyone could hope to have. She is intellectually brave, she is thoughtful, and she really brings a commitment to rigor and excellence, but in a way that is truly respectful of individuals, meeting people where they are, and truly helping them move forward in ways that are best for them. And I think that is a really important thing that we want to have in our chairs. So with that, I will ask Liz to come up.
Thank you. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Mary Jo Bona. She is Distinguished SUNY Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and affiliated faculty in English, as Carl has already shared. She currently serves as Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences. Briefly speaking, Dr. Bona is an award-winning teacher, a dedicated mentor to students and faculty alike, a one-of-a-kind colleague, I think most folks would agree with that, and an unapologetically feminist scholar. Her research expertise lies in feminist literary studies with a focus on multi-ethnic literatures, transnational migration, and Italian-American diasporas. She is the author of several scholarly monographs, including Claiming a Tradition, Italian-American Women Writers, By the Breath of Their Mouths, Narratives of Resistance in Italian America, and Women Writing Cloth, Migratory Fictions in the American Imaginary. Her work has appeared in the top journals and key collections across her primary fields, and her next monograph, we should all start getting excited, Mother's Mobility Narrative, Comparative Studies of Maternality in U.S. Literature, is currently under contract with SUNY Press. Collectively, this work weaves together feminist criticism, migration studies, and material culture theory to push Italian-American studies in new directions and to offer fresh insights into the way we study and even think about gender, ethnicity, and literature. Importantly, Dr. Bona's scholarly contributions extend beyond her single-authored projects and include the extensive field-forming work she has done throughout her career. She is the editor or co-editor of 4 different collections, including The Voices We Carry, Recent Italian-American Women's Fiction, and Multi-Ethnic Literature and Canon Debates. These collections have played foundational roles in establishing the fields of multi-ethnic literature and Italian-American studies in particular. In recent years, she has continued her commitment to the laborious work of field formation in her role as the series editor of multi-ethnic literatures at SUNY Press. Now, Dr. Bona is clearly an accomplished literary scholar. Also, did I mention that she is a published poet? You may want to check out her beautiful and moving poetry collection entitled I Stop Waiting for You. But in addition to, and perhaps partly in spite of, her disciplinary attachments, Dr. Bona has been a major player in the struggle to establish, to maintain, and against all odds, to grow the field of women's gender and sexuality studies. Her investment in interdisciplinary feminist scholarship stems back to her doctoral training, where she paired her PhD in English with concentrations in women's studies, women's history, and African American studies. Throughout her academic career, first at Gonzaga University and then here at Stony Brook, she has fiercely advocated for institutional recognition and, crucially, institutional support for WGSS as a field. Her service and leadership, like her research and teaching, reflect her profound commitment to feminist knowledge production. So it is with great excitement and with enormous respect that I offer this introduction. So please join me in welcoming our campus's most distinguished feminist scholar, Dr. Mary Jo Bona. You got me.
Good afternoon, everyone. Liz, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Monica for putting this together. When I first met Monica, I was afraid of her, but I'm no longer. We've gotten to know each other quite well, and she has a lot of energy and diligence. And but thank you, Monica, for doing this. Carl Lejeune, you've been a wonderful, wonderful provost to us here at Stony Brook. Thank you for introducing all of us. And Judith, you're coming up next, so it's all good. I want to thank also my writing worms, Christina Lusenko and Nancy Heemstra. They're the ones who kept me grounded when I was doing a major revision of this book. And we meet each other in the mornings at 6:30 a.m., so we don't often see the best in each other at that time. But I want to thank them for helping us through this time, and I wanted to name them. So here I go. Oh, there it is. Okay. So introduction, project, methodology, and terms. And since both Carl and Liz talked about my area studies, I'll just say this. I am a literary scholar who studies multi-ethnic American literatures. And then I'll move right into the presentation. So today's presentation emerges from a manuscript on motherhood studies in U.S. literature across genres, and by genres I mean specific types of narratives such as the novel and the autobiography. Across eras, I begin in the mid-19th century with an anti-slavery autobiography and conclude in the millennium with a post-AIDS novel set in 1980s Chicago. A central aim of my project is to examine how motherhood is represented in U.S.-based literary text across different time periods and addressing urgent but distinct social concerns. While largely a trans-historical comparative project, I analyze narrative works through the lens of motherhood literary studies and argue all the writers narrate the activity of mothering, by which I mean both mothering and daughtering, under unforgiving constraints. My methodology is both text-based and comparative. By pairing texts across different eras, generations, and cultural identities, I try to show how ideological understandings of maternal bodies shift in meaning and are dismantled before our reading eyes when set in largely segregated spaces, as singular as plantation space and epidemic space. By pairing texts and placing them in relation to each other, I claim for them valuable non-genealogical inheritances as they achieve a kind of solidarity in company with each other. The narrative works I consider engage in multiple incarnations of mothering on a shifting maternal continuum. Nonetheless, specific conceptual patterns regarding maternality emerge, including a reparenting of, a reparenting of friends whose non-procreative desires clear a space for connective work beyond the familial. This pattern of reparenting is the focus of my final chapter of this manuscript and of my presentation today, in which I pair Carol Maso's The Art Lover, published in 1990, and Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believers, published in 2018, to examine a reproduction of mothering through a type of reparenting that identifies queer kinship from lesbians and sisters who mother dying men, helping to ease their crossing. Two feminist scholars who have centrally influenced my framework and guided my interpretations. Let me go there. Oops. There's the first one, okay? Are in crucial ways. The first is Adriana Cavarero, an Italian philosopher, and the second is Patricia Hill Collins, a Black American sociologist. I want to look at these two very briefly in tandem. Cavarero's probative reinterpretation of ancient myths of maternity invite me to examine how such figures as Demeter and Persephone implicitly and explicitly undergird the narratives under consideration. Rather than supporting patriarchy, ancient maternal figures manipulate perceptions of time, including halting time, to ensure their continuation of the mother-daughter bond. Likewise, I employ Collins' term, othermothering, to explore practices of maternity that Collins locates in Black mothering, but I locate more broadly to examine mothering across multi-ethnic cultures and in contextual situations of people in racial, ethnic, LGBTQ communities, unsupported by a political economy that separates family from public life. From these two feminist scholars, I then extend an exploration of depictions of what Cavarero refers to as abduction and Collins describes as practices of othermothering, to argue that the authors radically reinterpret motherhood through a persistent critique of institutional failures to support maternal work. Collins' trope of othermothering equips me then to examine a variety of maternal practices that take place under severe conditions, from the most trenchant context of slavery to immigrant maternity, and from mother abandonment to affiliative mothering beyond the consanguine. By reinvesting in the dynamics of maternal love through depictions of caregiving by young women who witness the cruelty of the AIDS epidemic, Maso also emphasizes the fact that this illness exceeds her ability to process her own mourning with a U. Yet in trying to express the inexpressible, Maso continues to meditate upon the relationship between private emotion and public awareness of the crisis. Maso gestures toward the necessity of public outreach to highlight the AIDS emergency in America that beset a generation of whom a high percentage were gay men in the 1990s. By including extra literary materials, including visual art forms, Maso challenges the limits of narrative itself by specifically questioning whether the genre of the novel can represent the unspeakable. To explore the idea of the unrepresentable more fully, I include Marian Hirsch's analysis of the intersection between narrative and visual culture after the Holocaust, to argue that Maso integrates counter-histories to, and I'm quoting from Hirsch, engage in alternative patterns of affiliation beyond the familial, forming alternate attachments across lines of difference. By doing so, the author claims the unsung histories of men who died catastrophic deaths, shaping a grief narrative through the lens of women who loved them. Maso's central character, Caroline, assumes a maternal role during this AIDS crisis and simultaneously reveals herself to be the daughter of a mother who commits suicide when she is only 6 years old. Caroline's mother was destroyed by patriarchal norms that delimited her own maternal development. Caroline's embrace of othermothering challenges and expands the reader's understanding of true mothering and ultimately permits Maso to examine the multidimensional ways in which maternal care is portrayed under times of extremity. So I'm just showing you the two covers of The Art Lover, one hardcover, one softcover. You really can sometimes tell a book by its cover. These are details, and each one of these details is referenced multiple times in the book and begins to mean something very specifically. So, overplot, genre, and metafiction. Because Maso's novel is multi-layered and multidimensional, I must simplify its complexity by focusing on the principal character of her overplot, Caroline Chrysler, an acclaimed author who serves as the lesbian friend, sister, other mother to her beloved friend as he lay dying. Maso represents Caroline as desperately lamenting her dying friend while simultaneously trying to write her novel. More than midway through The Art Lover, Maso shifts into the genre of memoir in contemporaneous response to this devastating reality in her own life. While trying to write during the AIDS crisis, Maso shelved her novel for 1 year because she could no longer sustain the idea of fictionalizing the experience of this kind of death. During this hiatus, Maso started collecting extra literary visual materials to help her further contextualize this health catastrophe. While Maso tried to write The Art Lover in the mornings before visiting Gary at St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village, which, by the way, closed in 2010, Maso stopped writing her novel about 2 other fictive families after Gary became ill, and instead, she just began collecting images. As she wrote, as a defense against chaos, collecting things to keep the world in place. So this refocusing on listing and documentation in The Art Lover is reflective of the protagonist Caroline's and the author Carol's desire to order her world, to save things. Assemblage becomes a way of recuperating the self. What Maso wrote. As a result of Gary Falk's fatal illness, Maso explained to interviewer Victoria Harris that she began to write a different book, refusing her editor's request to take out the 65 graphics and to make the nonfiction section fictional, integrated into the fiction. I can just see what this editor looks like. So Maso includes some 65 images in her revisioning of the novel, making the graphics a textual strategy that are part and parcel of the novel. So, like Persephone, the protagonist Caroline is raised without a mother by a father who influences her view of the world through a dispassionate response to loss. And I don't mean to offend anybody's area study here. Caroline's father is a renowned art history professor. As the passionate daughter of a mother who committed suicide when she was only 6 years old, Caroline adopts a Demeter and Persephone-like approach to maternal nurturance. She cannot bear her daughter's absence, and she cannot bear being absent from her mother. Caroline's own maternal approach toward her beloved friend who is dying borders on the unbearable. Her modus operandi could not be more suitable reflection of the time. Caroline refuses to reify the AIDS crisis through moralizing discourses that quickly emerged in the 1980s, one of which linked homosexuality with sinful behavior resulting and leading to death. Aware of the vitriolic language used against AIDS victims during this time. To wit, Maso references the political conservatism of the 1980s, attributing President Reagan's refusal to use the word AIDS or to recognize a national health emergency as being complicit with those whose agendas were overtly homophobic. Maso disrupts any kind of totalizing narrative about homosexuality and AIDS in favor of portraying her central character devoted to her dying friend, broadening knowledge of maternal love during this era. Memory keeper Caroline recognizes that despite having no framework for understanding what is happening during this era, she will function as the scaffolding to support her friend. Maso's authorial investment in the other mother clarifies the complementary dimensions of motherhood portrayed in The Art Lover. So after, I'm going to use both the fictional and the non-fictional name. After Stephen Gary becomes ill, he is regularly segregated and placed in epidemic space, embarking on a nightmarish journey marked by pain. Some of the symptoms of his illness, HIV/AIDS, also mimic those experienced by pregnant women, especially morning sickness, and Holocaust victims, particularly wasting syndrome. Maso explicitly makes these connections to highlight her authorial investment in historiographic metafiction to illuminate macro-social sicknesses shared across cultural periods. In doing so, Maso enlarges the historical bandwidth to include the role of maternality during one such period of extremity. So now allow me briefly to explain two ways Maso appraises caregiving during the AIDS crisis. First, she focuses on the use of art as a vehicle to consolidate her reparenting activities as a caregiver. Maso makes multiple references to art to centralize the relationship between female other mothers and men dying in the prime of their lives, unable to engage in their artistic enterprises. The role that Caroline assumes suggests the reparative nature of her love as she exhibits the artistic contributions of Stephen Gary, too ill to do so himself. So alongside canonical and postmodern artists, Maso showcases Gary Falk's artwork 7 times in The Art Lover. There's one of them, acting herself as an art lover, a museum curator, and a queer mother. The second way Maso represents maternal care work is through her portrayal of the death vigil, which includes brief recoveries in The Art Lover. As principal caregiver, Caroline exhibits maternal profusion, repeatedly referencing suffering and apostrophizing her beloved. Desperately longing to support her dying friend, Caroline emphatically witnessed the unimaginable, events in excess of their frames of reference, as Shoshana Fellman and Dory Laub explain of those traumatized by Holocaust witnessing. Caroline willfully aligns her maternal body with the dying body of Gary Stephen, mirroring empathy during the death vigil and enacting shared kinship through practices of Couvaid syndrome. Also called sympathetic pregnancy, Caroline experienced somatic responses to pain that exceeds their own physical and emotional limits. As a result, Caroline claims a queer, maternal, and filial relationship with the beloved, insisting on a connection that not only embraces and exceeds those bonds, but fundamentally redefines them. Hieroglyphs of Hope, the epigraph in one of the final sections of The Art Lover, portrays Caroline and Stephen united outside the hospital one last time. In this scene, Maso reimagines a delectable Last Supper, capital L, capital S, including the recipe for the butterflied leg of lamb, or at least the marinade, along with the music of Der Rosenkavalier, thankfully a comic opera, the prologue Stephen once played at his funeral. Maso clarifies this crucial point. Joy is still alive when Caroline prepares herself to miss Stephen the rest of her life. This is a quotation, "When I close my eyes, he is still there. When I look away, he is still there. He is my brother." And looking at him and knowing all this, I realize that this is as perfect a moment on earth as I can expect. In response to Stephen's imminent death, Caroline accepts multiple roles of mother, sister, lover, and widow, but refuses the role of grief inside the parameters of patriarchy. She will be the lesbian widow who embraces the fact that Stephen is dying from an incurable disease and from state indifference. Unlike the traditional widow's response, "I was not ready, I'm a widow," Maso writes in contrast, "I can't believe this happened to you." As an observing witness, Caroline is also learning how to be with Stephen through his illness, paradoxically turning illness into an exhilarating story about what Arthur Frank calls other relatedness. This has to do with me as I with it. Understanding Caroline Carroll's role is also part of a collective experience. Maso largely engages the defining mantra of ACT UP, there it is, through her epigraph, "Because silence has always equaled death," alluding not only to the iconic poster made by the collective, but also to demonstrate Caroline's and Stephen's marriage of true minds. We are singing for our lives. We are fighting for our lives. We are speaking for our lives. The ineluctable bond between Caroline and Stephen is presented as hieroglyphic hope, comprehensible to neither, but framed by the protagonist's devotion to Stephen and the overwhelming fact of his dying. Maso brackets off this section with stacked images inserted in between Caroline's prose. One of those images is a reproduction of Matisse's Virgin and Child on a starry background. Suffice to say that Maso's inclusion of Matisse illuminates the artist's revisionism to an ethos of maternality. Surrounded by the simplicity of stars, Matisse's lithograph, Virgin and Child, releases the mother-child bond from its strictly biblical story, displaying a youthful Mary surrounding her child with heart-shaped arms and stars surrounding both. In a one-sentence conclusion before Maso inserts the Matisse reproduction, Caroline moves her hand towards Stephen across the dinner table, declaring to herself, "It is not nearly over." A radical revision of the final words of Jesus on the cross, "It is finished." While Caroline willingly entertains the thought of reuniting in the afterlife with Stephen, who is Jewish, she also knows it might be an illusory dream. Adopting instead a lexicon of kinship, Caroline both inhabits and, as Freeman explains, exceeds the matrix of couplehood and reproduction, and in her relationship with Stephen embraces a queer belonging that claims filial, widowed, and maternal status. "He is my brother. You have become my child." By inserting and juxtaposing the Matisse reproduction with Gary Fawkes' Red Dawn, Maso highlights flight as Fawkes' graphic art portrays a Pegasus-like figure flying away from a sickbed and toward a star. Fawkes' use of chiaroscuro includes a bifurcated background of charcoal for the white-framed bed and black background for the winged horse shown in flight, crossing from charcoal to black. Maso recognizes Falk's willingness to probe the unknown and to continue questioning the uses of art, to assure a continuity and movement that might not exist. By refusing to submit to nihilism as any final response to loss, Caroline recalls, even if she cannot reclaim, her art historian father's modernist aesthetic. I'm going to put these side by side as they are in the book. To conclude, Maso offers her own testimony to the epidemic, even though she knows that to write it down is always to get it wrong. In this way, she agrees with modernist poet W.H. Auden, who famously wrote, "For poetry makes nothing happen." But in a later poem, also wrote, "Words are for those with promises to keep." That last Auden passage was used as an epigraph by Timothy F. Murphy, who published one of the earliest collections on AIDS. Murphy insists that it is better to write something than to say nothing, and thereby let death, in its extinguishing finality, arrogate to itself all privilege in deciding the fate and worth of human life. Maso commits to representing finality through actions taken by maternal figures like Caroline, whose other-mothering practices redefine a maternal epistemology that embraces the desiring body. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. We have time for some questions now.
Did I keep to time? Okay.
First one ever, probably the only.
No pressure, Judith.
Hey.
Hey. Hi, Celia.
Hi. So I was really interested at the end when you talked about the modernist aesthetic, because the whole time you were talking, I was thinking about T.S. Eliot, who would be turning in his grave. These fragments I have shored against my ruin, right?
Yes.
And then also the allusions to the Greek and Roman myths. And I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about this very modern tale about a pandemic no modernist would have imagined, that has all of these connections to the early 20th century aesthetic and cultural movement.
Thanks for asking that, Celia. I mean, Maso's, trying to critique what we call modernism, because there's this kind of belief, or at least I had to look up a lot of stuff about art. I hope there's no art historians in here. I was just making up stories about what I thought these things meant. But what I was trying to get to with regard to modernism, and I think what Maso was trying to get to, is it's not enough, right? And I think that she's on the cusp of shifting from this sort of modernist belief that there are fragments against the ruins, that we can at least call those up to be okay in the world. And she's saying, maybe not. But she keeps sort of succumbing to it, right? And one of the voices that continues in her head is her father's voice. He has just died as the narrative begins, Caroline's father, and he keeps reminding her about the importance of aesthetic distance, and she is angry with him because she refuses to distance herself from this particular crisis. And she keeps saying, "Father, why can't you see all these dying men who are the size of skeletons walking down the street in New York City? How can you pretend that art can heal this?" So she keeps critiquing it and trying to go beyond it. And she's questioning all kinds of art. There's even a graphic of the Guerrilla Girls poster in there to try to make clear, and Kruger's works, or a postmodern artist. But she comes from an era in which she's very familiar with that kind of focus on modernism. But it's not enough. Dispassionate response to this kind of catastrophe isn't good enough. That would be her. I hope I helped a little bit in trying to respond to that. Hi.
Hi, Mary Jo.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Sarah.
So interesting and moving. Maybe inevitably, my mind went not to the modernist tradition, but to older and more traditional customs and cultures. And I was thinking about the role of women in Catholic, Christian, Italian funeral.
Something I may know about.
Funeral and burial practices,
Yeah.
and also how the representation of the Pietà, so not Madonna and child, but Madonna and dead son on her lap, to what extent you think any of that intersects with this work?
It's filled with it, Sarah. I mean, in some ways, the Mater Dolorosa is a more important figure, the Pietà. And one of the ways in which I've written about it in the past is that this is a novel about the Passion, right? And I shifted away from it when I was sort of doing stuff on Othermothering, but it's absolutely related. The other thing I wanted, since you brought it up, and you do early modern stuff, the way in which Maso seems to be engaging death is in a pre-modern way. In other words, death is more spiritually sanctioned for her. It's about expiration, right? The soul, not termination, the dead end. So it's as sad as this book is, it's extremely joyful too. And that's part of it. Thank you for asking that.
Any other question?
I'll stay over here. Can I push you a little bit more on that? Because the thing that I couldn't help but keep thinking as you were talking is, to what extent, this wonderful other mothering, this rewriting of mothering away from the biological and the genealogical in these women is also linked to their rewriting through, but also away from, a destiny that's written in the blood in terms of ethnicity. I want to push you on that because also that myth, Demeter, Persephone, it keeps coming back again and again in Italian-American writing.
Right, it's everywhere.
In African Italian-American writing, in, going to that mythical motherhood rather than that narrow lineage of blood.
Right. Thank you. I mean, I started thinking about the book as The Daughter's Abduction, because I was playing with Jane Gallup's, what was the title of that, The Seduction, that book. And I'm at that age where I just can't remember things and I don't give a damn. It's like, okay, it's all right, I can't remember it. But you're right, you want to push me on it, but I still notice it everywhere. And sometimes when you're looking for something that you're looking for, you'll find it anyway. And I do understand that. But the way in which Cavallaro deals with that tale is about the way in which, well, and especially with the tale of Penelope, which I also use, in the way in which she sort of stops time and manages her own destiny under extreme odds. And it's her waiting maids that become the daughters. In that, so I think it's useful. It can be nostalgic almost as well. So you've got me thinking about how to deal with that a little bit more. So when you say you want to push me on it, could you later on send me an email and remind me of what I need to do? Okay, we'll have coffee. That's beautiful. A little espresso. Okay.
I'm thinking Kim Ragusa's last day.
Yes.
She chooses to eat the pomegranates.
Yes. And she chooses Ovid's tale, right? Because that way she has agency, yes, right? And the way in which I analyze that particular memoir, autobiography, is through a sort of how does she get abandoned in certain ways as a result of the situation as being a mixed race child whose Italian people reject her because she's black. So, but thank you for making me think about that. Anyone else? Oh, boy.
No, I'm way more nervous to ask this question than you were to answer it, trust me. Plus, no one's afraid of me. So.
Okay, ask me.
So you said two things and you juxtaposed them, and I thought each of them on their own were so interesting, and I'd just like to ask a little bit more on how the two play together in your larger thesis. So the second part is writing things down means that there's promises you have to keep, which I completely get, but the first one, to write it down is to always get it wrong. Yeah. And there's just so many ways that each of those are so beautiful on their own.
Right.
So if you could just flesh that out a little more.
I remember reading this book in 1990 when it first came out and experiencing this AIDS crisis very deeply in my own life. And when Maso wrote, to write it down is to always get it wrong, it's really honest, isn't it? Because the way in which language works, you get something down, right? But it doesn't quite capture completely what you're trying to say. I think that's how clearly she understands it. And Maso herself is my generation, and she had to stop writing the book the way she was writing it because she couldn't bear the thought, as many other victims of traumatic events have experienced, that she could not write about it, because to do so would be not to even approach the suffering of the individual that they're trying to sort of embrace. So that's the one. And what I love about the second Auden quotation, it's a nice sort of complement and contrast to, well, for poetry makes nothing happen, right? But when you write something down, you have promises to keep. That was a way for AIDS activists and AIDS scholars to take a look at, should we write about this? Because there was a lot of pushback about writing about AIDS, narrating AIDS. In the day, Douglas Crimp said, to do this is to do damage. And this sounds very much like how Holocaust victims felt about having, reading stories about the Holocaust. But eventually you have to do it, even if you get it sort of slanted, tell the truth, but tell it slant. At least it gets down in some kind of way that might allow other people to grieve along with you during such a kind of health crisis as this one was. I hope that helped a little bit, Carl.